Okay, good afternoon everybody, and a very warm welcome to St Mary's Church. I'll just go through the housekeeping bits first. So if any of you do need the facilities, if you go to the back of church and out to the side door and round to the left of church, that'll bring you to the parish hall behind church, and the loos are in there. Okay, if there's a fire, please get out. And after our fantastic session with Sir James, you're all very welcome to come for tea and coffee, and we've got some cake and biscuits in the parish hall afterwards, so don't rush off if you don't have to. Okay, so we come together as always in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Pope Francis has asked us to dedicate this year as a year of prayer to prepare for the Jubilee year. And he said, "I would greatly desire that we devote 2024, the year preceding the Jubilee event, to a great symphony of prayer." So perhaps we could say together, on the back of your little cards is the year of prayer. So, God of blessings, in this year ahead, give us a spirit of listening, of openness to your word, and longing for your kingdom. As we journey towards the Jubilee, a time of new beginnings, we pray for help and strength to heal our relationships with each other and all creation. Sing your song of love over us, renewing our faith and courage, so we may join our voices together, discovering new harmonies of hope, new melodies of reconciliation. Attentive to the Spirit and awake to the needs of the world, may we seek your life-giving presence as we join as one global family in a great symphony of prayer and praise. Amen. So in response to Pope Francis's request, we've been holding a series of workshops throughout the year, and we're honoured and delighted to welcome the world-renowned composer and fellow parishioner, Sir James MacMillan, to lead us in our final workshop, which is prayer and sacred music. So without further ado, I give you Sir James MacMillan.
Thank you very much, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming along this afternoon to this, the last in the series of sessions of reflection on prayer and other aspects of our lives, our culture, and so on. And when Sandy asked me to be involved in this, she specifically asked me to speak about music, which I was delighted to do. It's my favourite subject. And so my talk today, it's more of a talk than a workshop. I prepared a script for you today. I prepared a series of thoughts, and I'll explain a little bit about where I'm coming from in my thoughts. But thank you, Sandy, for inviting me to give this talk today. Some of you will know me. You've probably seen me around here on a Sunday morning. I'm a composer. I moved to this part of the world about 9 years ago. I live up in the back of Beyond, up the Brisbane Glen, which is a very beautiful place, of course, those of you who know it, and very, very good place for a composer to live, because it's very conducive to work. It's very quiet, and some beautiful views. And I spend my time working and writing music. When I travel, it's usually to in other countries and other places, and I have a connection with University of St Andrews as well. I'm a very part-time professor in something called the Institute for Theology, Imagination and the Arts. I'm not a theologian, but I think the people there work real musicians and real artists to be involved in the project. So from that work in particular that I want to share some of my thoughts with. I've given this talk a title. The title is Music and the Sacred in Antiquity and in Modernity. So music and the sacred in antiquity and in modernity. So obviously it's about music, and it's about music's mysterious, sometimes umbilical relationship with religion. As you know, throughout the centuries, composers have, in a sense, been very much involved in the liturgy, writing for the liturgy. I once heard composers in the past being described as midwives of faith. And I think I know what that means, in that a composer's desire to serve the liturgy has led to the composition of some of the great works of music from the past, from the Bach Passions, of course, Handel's Messiah, and even earlier the great mass and motet settings of Palestrina and so on. So I'm very aware of a heritage and a tradition which links music and the sacred. And it's about that tradition in particular, that I want to talk to you about today. However, the second phrase is just as important: in antiquity and in modernity. So I will be talking about the deep past, not just the beginnings of the church and the church's liturgy before that, and asking questions about why we sing our prayers, and have done so, not just centuries, but in the case of our older brothers and sisters in faith, the Jews, for millennia. And in modernity, we meet here today as moderns. I feel very much a living composer, or at least I was the last time I checked. And I'm very aware that these discussions are still alive in our own time. Sometimes in the wider culture, one imagines the arts and religion to have come apart, that there is no link anymore between religion, reflection on religion, and the search for the sacred, and those of us who are involved in the arts. And in some branches of the arts, that is very much the case. I can think of my colleagues in literature and in theatre and filmmaking who never think about religion, never think about God, and never imagine that a reflection on the divine or a search for the sacred has anything to do with them. And consequently, we live at a time where we, rightly or wrongly, imagine that religion is old hat and no longer part of the cutting edge of modern culture. And in some branches of the arts, that's very much the case, you could say. But in music, I would argue that is not the case, that the age of unbelief has not affected those who write music. And there are deep reasons for this, and we can maybe explore some of them today. It could be because music and the spirit have a very close connection. Amongst my colleagues and my fellow lovers of music, I hear many of them, whether they're believers or not, and most of them are not, will say things like music is the most spiritual of the arts. What do they mean by that? Do they mean the same as I mean it? There is a connection between music and the arts, because music, in a sense, is an art form that can open a window or a door to the divine. Is that what the skeptic thinks as well? Well, perhaps deep in his heart, that is exactly what they think, because they know that music can change them. Music has this ability to impact deeply on an individual's life, to the extent that one's life is transformed by music. And for lovers of music, and I speak as someone with a background in classical music, so my references will be to classical music mostly today, art music if you like. I'm very much aware that the audience that I meet in that world may not share my worldview, my faith, but they speak deeply and seriously about the impact, the spiritual impact that music has on their lives. And in that sense, that there is a meeting place between those of us of faith and those of us, those who don't have faith, in our love of music. Because we know that music has this impact that can change our perspectives, that can bring about transformations in the way that we see the world, the way that we lead our lives, the way that we conduct relationships. And that points to an art form which is greater than the sum of our parts. It points to a humanity, a common humanity that has reach into the sacred, into the intellectual, into the spiritual, and therefore has great numinous power. So that's to explain the modernity bit. I'll be doing a bit of explaining of the antiquity bit too, because I need to talk about, in trying to explain why we sing our prayers, I want to talk about musical history. And the history of arts music is shaped by religious music. And the great classical forms from the 12th century through to the 17th and beyond have their origins in Gregorian chant. And I want to talk a little bit about Gregorian chant today as well, because a lot of the origins of music lie in that sound, that very sound of the church. You could say that the sound of Catholicism, if you like, is the sound of Gregorian chant. And it has very deep roots in the first millennium of the church. And as I'll try to try to explain, it has origins even before Christ was with us in culture, in Jewish culture in particular. Part of my intention today is to draw attention to the technical and historical influences that Gregorian chant, it's a form of music that's sometimes heard in this church and some of the other churches in large and throughout the world still, and plain song have had on the development of art music, principally from medieval times. However, I think it's only right that I begin with a fundamental theological point about music and its connections and its Is this working? Is it off and on? Okay. So from my vantage point as a modern composer, surveying the development of music through the 20th century into our present time, I can observe that music's search for the sacred, acknowledged music lovers, as I say, to have been constant through history, did not disappear in our age of unbelief. In fact, in a century where we have charted the retreat of faith in many aspects of our culture, the world of art music, and I think many other forms of music too, have shown clear evidence of creativity and the specific imagination of composers being maintained and nourished by a spiritual quest. It's an extraordinary fact, ladies and gentlemen, that in the last 100 years or so, some of our major composers have been profoundly religious men and women. And that's a fact that is forgotten sometimes in culture, and it's a fact that is sometimes ignored by musicologists. And I want to show you what I mean by that. And I think this chart the oft view of many music lovers, whether they're believers or not, music indeed is spiritual of the arts. One of the big surprises in my life has been the wider recognition that spiritual inspirations behind the great composers, past and present, grew and continued through the 20th century, this age of unbelief. That means that in this era of unbelief, a search for the sacred has been manifest in music's journey through modernity. There has been a sometimes reluctant concession from the wider culture that religion has played a huge part in musical modernity, from composers like Wagner to the present day. As I say, some of the world's most important composers over the last 100 years or so, surprisingly perhaps, were profoundly religious men and women. Not all were conventional religious believers, some were not even Christians, as I'll explain, but the search has been constant and widespread in musical modernity, from Stravinsky, one of my favourite composers, through to Arvo Pärt, who's still alive and whose company I was in recently, and John Tavener, and lots of others in between. Let me start with Stravinsky. You may know some of his music. His most famous work is The Rite of Spring, written in 1913, and there was a riot at the first performance of this piece. It's a ballet score. It's a convulsive piece of early musical modernism. But Stravinsky was as conservative in his religion as he was revolutionary in his musical imagination, with a deep love of his Orthodox roots in Russia, as well as the Catholicism he encountered in the West. He set the Psalms, famously in the Symphony of Psalms. He set the Mass. He was a man of faith. And then another composer that some of you may have heard of, Arnold Schoenberg, the other great figure of early 20th century modernism, was a mystic, and he reconverted to Judaism after he left Germany in the 1930s. And his later work is infused with Jewish culture and theology. And he pondered deeply on the spiritual connections between music and silence. It's something that composers do a lot. Paradoxically, music is something that begins in the silence of our own hearts. It's from that deep silence that these sometimes convulsive sounds arise. One can't help but reflect, therefore, as a composer, that perhaps that silence, the silence in which the music begins, is a silence of contemplation, a silence of prayer, in fact. One of my favourite composers is a Frenchman called Olivier Messiaen. He died about 20 years ago, and he was famously Catholic. And every note of his unique contribution to music was shaped by his deep religious conviction and liturgical practice. All through his life, he used to play organs in some of the big churches in Paris. And there are, in my view, two composers in history who may be described as theologians. One is J.S. Bach, the great figure from the Baroque, and the other is Olivier Messiaen. And Messiaen was a powerful influence on the younger composers who came after him, avant-garde composers, the most important modernist figures of our age. And therefore, Messiaen, the teacher, has to be counted as one of the most impactful, the most important composers of our modern times. His Catholicism, far from being an impediment to this, was the major, indeed singular, factor behind it. Messiaen wrote one opera, St. Francis of Assisi. The life and the miracles of St. Francis are the subject matter of his opera. But the most important French Catholic opera of the 20th century was written by Francis Poulenc. I'm going to show you an extract from this in a little moment to highlight what I'm talking about. His Dialogue of the Carmelites appeared in 1956. As the American Jesuit Mark Bosco comments, no other opera combines 20th century musical sensibilities with such profound theological themes on Catholic mysticism, martyrdom, and redemption. It's strange then, in these secular times, in this age of unbelief that I've been talking about, that such a work has become one of the most popular and regularly performed modern operas of the age. It's one of the most beloved operas of the last 60-odd years, performed all over the world. And there is something about it which doesn't chime well with the accepted orthodoxies and pieties of our age, especially in the country of its birth, France. France, the world's first secular republic, launched a revolutionary war against organized religion, as you're aware, and against the Catholic Church specifically. And there's no comfortable, airy-fairy spirituality in this opera. It's based on a true story from the beginning of modern revolutionary violence. that of 16 Carmelite nuns guillotined in the terror of the French Revolution. The opera was in fact an act of defiance on the part of the composer against the founding narrative of his own society, the secular terror of that time and the secular orthodoxies of the modern world. You will remember the French Revolution was a revolution that had removed the images of Jesus and his mother from the churches and replaced them with the goddesses of the future, thus inspiring the subsequent revolutions and convulsions of the 20th century and the ongoing onslaught against religion. It's in the roots of the French Revolution gave rise to subsequent convulsions, the Bolshevik Revolution and its onslaught against religion, the rise of fascism and communism in the 20th century, and so on. And so, for a culture that was meant to have put all these old things behind it, the dialogue of the Carmelites is a bold rebuttal of secular arrogances and certainties, and a beautiful proclamation of what some might claim as Catholic truths. And here, as the Jesuit Bosco highlights, he says, traditional Catholicism becomes intellectually compatible with all that was modern and progressive in French culture in the early part of the 20th century. Poulenc's opera is at once a Catholic story of heroism and faith, and yet speaks to the modern world, an opera for the post-war period of Europe in the 1950s, and one resonant with our contemporary struggle with Christian faith and martyrdom. And when you're watching this opera, remember it's an opera, it's not a piece of church music, it's not a mass setting or anything. Ask yourself the question, is this sacred music, or is it secular music, or is it a strange hybrid between them? And in this extract, this is the climactic moment of the final act, when the women go to their deaths. So at this crucial point, in one of the 20th century's most important and beloved operas, what is it that we're hearing? What do we hear being sung? Is this part of the libretto by the composer based on the play by Georges Bernanos that we hear? No. As you'll see and hear, it's the ancient hymn to Our Lady, the Mother of God, the Salve Regina, words that are sung in this church quite regularly and in many other places, I'm sure. This is a moment of defiant challenge inherent in Poulenc's own search for the sacred in modernity. At the heart of one of his most important masterpieces, one of the great artistic achievements of modernity in this age of unbelief, we hear the words, "Hail, Holy Queen, Mother of Mercy, O clement, O loving, O sweet Virgin Mary." Thank you. So, Poulenc. And maybe just recapping some of these other composers that I mentioned. Stravinsky. And there's a whole range of composers, as I say, in this age of unbelief who are interested in exploring this search for the sacred. There's even a large group of them from behind what was the old Iron Curtain. Some of them still alive, like Arvo Pärt and so on, who, again, were courageous figures, even more courageous than Poulenc, who stood out and against the prevailing dead-hand orthodoxy of the day, state atheism. And in this country, after Benjamin Britten, have come Jonathan Harvey, John Tavener, and many others. So my final point about modernity in this instance is, far from being a spent force, religion has proved to be a vibrant, animating principle in modern music and continues to promise much for the future. It could even be said that any discussion of modernity's mainstream in music would be incomplete without a serious reflection on the spiritual values, the belief and practice at work in composers' minds. So it's within this analysis of modern music's universal context that I'm able to find a way of communicating my own particular personal approach to composing. And with all these composers in mind, I don't feel alone. I'm sometimes asked by secular commentators whether I feel on a periphery being a religious composer. Well, I know, what about all these wonderful composers of our own time? So what has happened in music in the 20th century, as I've described it here, gives me much encouragement. And far from being isolated or peripheralized in the world of music because of my religion, I felt quite central in it and quite dynamically engaged as a believer with the swirl of ideas that surrounds us. And it's this engagement that's given me confidence and inspiration to write a series of works, choral and instrumental, which have sprung out of theological and liturgical reflections. One of my most recent ones, my Christmas oratorio, I conducted it in Glasgow and Edinburgh last year, and I'm heading off to Budapest in a few weeks to conduct it over there. But I thought it might be helpful to give you a short burst of something that I've written. This is the anthem that I was asked to compose for the Queen's funeral in 2022. I was told that this passage from Paul's letter to the Romans was one of Her Majesty's favourite moments in the New Testament. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? That was modernity. What about antiquity? It's time to look into the deep past. I've been interested in making a careful scrutiny of our musical heritages, but also our spiritual heritages. And this has involved an embrace of Christianity's most fundamental musical origins. Even in modernity, such as the composers I've been talking about, composers have drawn on this too. Some of the composers I've mentioned have used Gregorian chant as starting points for their own work in one way or another. And so I suppose this is a sign that that monastic music, because Gregorian chant began in the monasteries, of course, so monastic music's influence on the development of historical art forms is not simply reserved to the medieval period or the Renaissance which followed, but it's alive and evolving even today. So let's begin with, or let's continue with early church history. And before we get to grips with the music, let's consider where the world's sacred songs come from. Why do Christians, for example, sing their prayers? Why do we come to churches like this, buildings like this, and sing our prayers? Singing has been part of Christian liturgy since the earliest days of the church. And it's widely thought that the Psalms of the pre-Christian Jewish worship significantly influenced and contributed to early Christian ritual and chant. It's certainly clear that early Christian rites did incorporate elements of Jewish worship. The canonical hours have their roots in Jewish prayer hours, for example. The sung amens and alleluias, such as we've just heard there, come from Hebrew. And the threefold sanctus, holy, 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 derives from the threefold kadosh of the Kedusha. And the New Testament mentions the singing of hymns at the Last Supper. There's this, for example, when they had sung the hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. We read that in Matthew's Gospel. This is an important point to pursue our theological and historical survey, because we know from this scriptural extract then, and a few other scriptural references, that Jesus was a singer. Jesus, like Jews and Christians today, sang his prayers. We know that Jesus was human like us and would therefore have sung melodies of human love, human lament, human joy, and human praise, all present in the Psalms. I think this is an awesome thought. What did the singing Jesus sound like? What would he have sounded like? And what would he have sung just before offering himself on the cross? As I say, Matthew wrote this, and when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. But the complete Jewish Bible goes on like this. It reads, and when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives after singing the Hallel. What is the Hallel? Well, for centuries before that first Maundy Thursday, the Jewish people always sang the Hallel at the meal at the end of the first day of Passover, and observant Jews still do it. That means that Jesus and his Jewish disciples sang Psalms 113 to 118, or selected stanzas from them that night. And they probably sang one part before the meal and another part after the meal. Almost certainly, therefore, the one song we know that Jesus did sing comes from Psalms 113 to 118. I wonder what he would have felt then as he sang these words. The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. The Lord has done this, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Psalm 118. And with the crucifixion just hours away, what did Jesus think as the 12 voice ensemble sang these lines? Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his faithful servants. Psalm 116. And with Judas gone out into the night, and with the meal ended, and the 11 standing around the empty platter, Jesus sang, "With the Lord on my side, I do not fear. What can mortals do to me? The Lord is on my side to help me." Psalm 118. And I have to think that Easter was brimming in his heart as he sang, "I will not die but live, and will proclaim that the Lord has done, what the Lord has done." Psalm 118. And what would it have sounded like? Well, scholars like William Peter Mart, the American musicologist, have interesting things to say about Gregorian chant, its origins and influences, and the influence it brought to bear on the music of the second millennium. And I'll get back to those, the singing disciples in a minute. But here, first of all, is Mart putting chant into its historical context. He says, "The history of Western music in the first millennium is essentially the history of Gregorian chant, and its living development extends well into the second millennium. It is thus a foundation stone which spans as great a historical period as the whole edifice built upon it." And then he goes on, "The liturgical usage of the Psalms includes ways of singing that go back to Hebrew practices. The relationship of Gregorian chant to Hebrew melodies has been explored by great Jewish scholars, some of whom have looked at recordings of melodies by Hebrew congregations in the Yemen and Babylonia. There are two specific ways of singing the Psalms in the Western Church. They're called recitative psalmody and melodic psalmody. Recitative psalmody, that is the psalm tones, is found primarily in the divine office. Psalmody is essentially the purpose of the office. There, the singing of the psalms is in itself a liturgical activity. Thus, the purpose of the psalm tones is a simple, sensitive declamation of the text. The melodies used are ancient, and they show a common procedure of intonation, mediation, and conclusion. I'd like to, if my voice is up to it, sing you, first of all, I'll give you an example of a Yemenite psalm tone, and then follow it with a Gregorian psalm tone. So here is the Yemenite psalm tone. And the Gregorian chant. And then the Gregorian chant, the melodic psalmody. Let's have a look at some of that. And this shows the close connection that Gregorian chant has with Hebrew psalmody again. I'm going to sing, first of all, let's see if I can find it, something from the Yemenite eulogy of the Haftarah. It has this melody. Compare that with this mode 8 track, the Cantemus Dominus. Cantemus Domino. Cantemus Domino. Cantemus Domino glorios There are very clear connections between the Gregorian melodies and these ancient melodies from before the existence of the church. Perhaps Christ would have recognized some of these archetypal melodic shapes and fragments which began to evolve in the Near East and in Europe in the emerging centuries of the new millennium. And as a Christian musician in the third millennium, I feel drawn to these common roots. roots which were springing into new and unbridled imaginative life at the hands of many of the composers from the 12th to the 17th century. Léonin Imperatin, Guillaume de Machaut, Dufay, Josquin des Prez, and of course Palestrina, who died in 1594. What is Gregorian chant then? Gregorian chant is a variety of plain song named after Pope Gregory I from the 6th century AD. Although Gregory himself did not invent the chant, the tradition linking Gregory I to the development of the chant seems to rest on a possibly mistaken identification of a certain Gregorian, probably Pope Gregory II, with his more famous predecessor. For several centuries, different plain chants existed concurrently. Standardization on Gregorian chant was not completed even in Italy until the 12th century. Plain chant, speaking in a musicological sense now, represents the first important step forward in the development of recognizable musical notation, as I'll show you in a minute. In the late 9th century, plain song began to evolve into organum. Now, organum is simply the singing of the chant against a version of itself a fourth or fifth apart. When you hear monks chanting in old Hollywood films, they're usually singing in organum, and it's meant to associate the mind or the imagination with medieval times and monasteries. But it led to the development of polyphony. That is that wonderfully complex development of choral music sung in the church, made in the church, composed for the church from the 13th century onwards. And the list of composers I gave you just a few minutes ago represents the thread of development of polyphony at the heart of Western music and the singing tradition of the Christian church from the 12th century through to the high point of the tradition of the late 16th century. And then it was carried forward thereafter by the likes of Victoria in Spain and by William Byrd in England. The DNA of this music, if you like, in one way or another, was Gregorian chant, either in the influence of melodic line and style on the contrapuntal parts themselves, or in the way that various composers built their complex musical constructions out of and based on actual chant melodies. In that sense, the contribution of monastic music, let's call it that, to the core development of Western music, my world of classical music, especially over those 5 crucial centuries, was huge. I want to show you a very practical example, visually and orally, of how this worked. I'm going to look specifically at the Missa de Nostre Dame by Guillaume de Machaut, which we think was written around 1360 in Reims in France. What you'll see here is just how tightly and integrally the chant is wound into the resulting polyphony, providing, as I say, a genuine musical DNA to the rich invention of the new form. I'll try and point things out as we go. So here is some very, very ancient notation, the first notation in the Western world. So here now is the chant that's based on. Keep an eye out for the opening of the phrase. Look out for these notes. Da, 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 da. First three or four notes. So, as I say, the chant is absolutely wound into the fabric of the polyphony that emerges. It's there as the root, as I say, the DNA. Round about, if you looked at the other parts, the incredible, rich tapestry of complex music that began to emerge. Remember, this is the 1300s, when this incredibly complicated music was beginning to emerge. And it's all rooted in the chant. I quoted earlier from William Peter Mart's book, this is it here, The Musical Shape of the Liturgy. The most pertinent chapter here is the 5th chapter, Gregorian Chant as a Fundamentum of Western Musical Culture. Much of this chapter deals with the chant's integral influence and effect on those crucial musical centuries in art music, the 12th to the 17th century. However, in his closing remarks, an interesting development in his thinking as they pertain to subsequent musical history. To cut a long story short, he goes back and explains that Gregorian chant burst into life again in its influence on music after the Renaissance, affecting composers like Haydn and Mozart, who worked chant into their own mass settings. And then into the 19th century, great composers like Bruckner, the Austrian composer, who used chant as the basis of some of his own choral music. And then into the 20th century, where in a sense we began this journey today with Stravinsky. In Stravinsky's mass setting, you can hear influence of the chant, sometimes in a direct way, sometimes in an indirect way. And on it goes. The relationship between the ancient and the modern is still alive. And so we've come full circle, ladies and gentlemen, back to the modernity where I began. The contribution of monastic music in the shape of Gregorian chant to the development of the history of Western music, let's call it, or Western art music, classical music, has been huge. But we have to remind ourselves why this form of music is the fundamental, as William Mart puts it, and why it is described as the paradigm of sacred music. Why is this the most sacred music, the most perfect music for the church? Well, there is holiness in the sound of this music. And music is an intrinsic part of the projection of sacredness in the liturgy. The word sacred means being set aside for a particular purpose. In the liturgy, the establishment of its unique purposes, that is, the glorification of God and the edification and sanctification of the faithful. It does this in two important ways. By setting the texts of the liturgy to singing, it provides the entire liturgy an elevated tone of voice that conveys its special character, presenting its texts, quote, as on a platter of gold, in the words of the musicologist and sociologist Father Joseph Jungmann. And so, ladies and gentlemen, with his friends, when Jesus sang the Hallel the night before he died, he offered these texts on his own melodious platter of gold to his own Father in heaven. After which, as Matthew tells us, he went out. He went out to the Mount of Olives. Thank you.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we've got time now for it. If any of you have got a question for Sir James, if you'd like to raise your hand, but if you'd like to wait until I come with the microphone so that everybody can hear it. And I know Sandy's got one from one of our daughters, Sophie.
Yeah.
Sophie and Charlotte, my daughters, are watching via live stream, and Sophie wanted to know, what was your earliest memory of sacred music? Can you recall?
My earliest memory of sacred music, well, it actually was of Gregorian chant, believe it or not, ladies and gentlemen. When I was a little boy, my mum and dad used to take me to visit relatives in Edinburgh, and being observant Catholics, they always went to Mass at the cathedral, St Mary's Cathedral, and so I'd be taken along there 5, 6 years old, and I was struck by what I heard there. I wasn't playing music at all, but I was struck by the beautiful sounds that I heard in that cathedral. Not just the choir singing some of this very rich polyphony, but the simplicity of the chant. It was the first time I had encountered chant, and it must have made a huge impression on me. And it was only later that I realised what that music would have been, chant and the polyphony that came from the chant. And that music's been a sort of guiding light for me, and some of my most favourite music ever since.
Thank you so much. I've so enjoyed this.
Thank you.
I brought along some of St Columba's Episcopal to enjoy it as well.
Wonderful.
But what I'd like to know, in view of what you said about ancient psalmody, are there any resources available to look further into this?
Right. Well, I'll tell you what. First of all, this book is worth reading. It's The Musical Shape of the Liturgy by William Peter Mart, M-A-H-R-T. He is an American sociologist, musicologist, still working and writing. But he cites a couple of sources which are worth exploring. I sort of rushed through it when I was reading this, but he says this: the relationship of Gregorian chant to Hebrew melodies has been explored by two great Jewish scholars. And the first one is Abraham Edelson, I-D-E-L-S-O-H-N, who recorded melodies of Hebrew congregations of the Yemen and Iraq. So Abraham Edelson has documented this and has published material on it. And those congregations are communities that we think were cut off from the outside contact since the destruction of the Second Temple. And then the other writer, academic that he cites is Eric Werner, W-E-R-N-E-R, who wrote a book called The Sacred Bridge. And he explored in detail in that book correspondences between Jewish liturgical music and Christian liturgical music.
when looking at composing something yourself, do you think of the building in which the piece is to be heard? And in doing so, do you build in silences so that the choral resonance continues before the next phrase comes through?
That's a very, very interesting question. Does a composer consider the building that the music's going to be performed in? Well, historically, the answer to that is obviously yes. I'll come to me in a minute, but some of the composers I've been talking about, like De Macho, for example, would have worked probably in the same cathedral building for years. Palestrina wrote his music for the Sistine Chapel, so they would not only have known those buildings and acoustics very well, but would have shaped their music in time and in delivery to suit the acoustics of that music. I was in the Sistine Chapel a few years ago, and it was pointed out to me that there's a tiny little balcony where the choir sang. And Allegri would have stood there, the composer of Allegri's Miserere, one of the most beautiful and famous pieces of choral music, the one that Mozart heard, and you weren't allowed to take the music away from the Vatican in those days, but Mozart scribbled it out. He could do that. He was Mozart. And people, so the story goes, people got to know Allegri's Miserere, but he was there, Mozart was there in the Sistine Chapel, had seen Allegri, or had seen people singing Allegri Miserere. I was taken into that balcony by a member of the Sistine Chapel, and I saw the names of some of these great composers scrolled onto the wall of the balcony, which was an incredible moment for me. People like Josquin des Prez, who's one of my most favourite composers. And these composers would have stood there, conducted the choir, written the music for that choir, and probably during, dare I say, a boring sermon by a cardinal perhaps, would have scrawled their name on the wall. It's quite a thought. But the light of those composers would have shaped their music with necessary silences. And the question of music's relationship with silence is very important. I touched on it very briefly in my talk. Not only does music emerge from the silence of one's own heart, but there sometimes has to be silences almost written into the music that's been written to allow the impact of the music, the notes, but also the words that are being heard to resonate with the hearers. And one of those Russian composers that I love very much, that came after Shostakovich and was deeply spiritual, deeply religious, in spite of what the Soviet Union was trying to do to religious people, Alfred Schnittke, said that he wrote lots of silences in his music, and he referred to those silences as silent tones. So he actually saw the silences in his music as equivalent to the notes that he wrote. So there is a case for the silences being almost as important as the notes themselves. And I've certainly been aware of that in the writing of my music. There's a piece of mine, the setting of the 7 last words, for example, where there are deliberately, there are bars written out, bars of silence written out. Sometimes there's 3 bars of silence where nothing happens, and sometimes there are 4 bars of silence. And I can't remember why there was 3 and then 4, but there seemed to be a reason at the time for what the listener had just heard to resonate in time enough during those silences. So silence is very important in the fabric of music, but it's also, as I say, important in the making of music, because it's in those deep silences and the solitude of the composer's heart that music begins.
Okay, well, thank you very, very much, Sir James, and on behalf of all of us, and perhaps we could just finish with a prayer. Our bishop has asked us to pray the Glory Be frequently during the Jubilee year, so perhaps we could say together, Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. And Do now, if you do have time, do come round for a cup of tea and a bit of cake and a biscuit in the hall. Thank you very much indeed.